I'm John Fenzel, and we're here on the northeast side of Gettysburg, right off of Coster Avenue. This is the site of what became known as the Brickyard fight. There may be no better way to really visualize and understand the collapse of the 11th Corps and the chaos of the Federal retreat through Gettysburg than right here where we're at. A lot has changed over more than 1.5 centuries. This has been built up quite a bit, as you can see. One thing you didn't see then on July 1st too was the snow, which you can see behind me and off to the right. But this is the spot where an incredibly momentous fight between the U.S. and Confederate troops happened. That first day of the battle, it became known as the Brickyard fight because John Kuhn's Brickyard was here at 221 North Stratton Street, right behind me. His two-story brick house faced the street. Beside it was a carriage gateway that provided access to a 5-acre pentagonal lot that was surrounded by heavy rail fences. Some portions of the yard near the house were fenced off for livestock and a garden, and behind that were brickworks, a wooden barn, dome-shaped brick kilns, and a pug mill, a small street, Stevens Run, that ran right along the southeastern portion of the yard and provided all the water that they needed. The Brickyard fight is also significant because of the human costs. The fight here ended up with more than 770 Union and Confederate casualties. So it wasn't a peripheral skirmish at all, but a hard-fought action that cost the Union troops dearly in soldiers killed, wounded, and captured, with one regiment, the 154th New York, suffering one of the highest casualty rates, 77%, that was endured throughout the entire Civil War. As significant as this battle was, it's been widely neglected by both historians and visitors to Gettysburg. For a long time, the Brickyard battle was considered by many to be just an inconsequential rear guard action at the end of a long day of much more significant combat. It involved only a single Union brigade, the 1st Brigade, commanded by Colonel Charles R. Coster, and 2 Confederate brigades. And maybe the most telling of all is that no after-action reports by Coster's brigade and his regimental commanders were ever included in the massive official records of the Union and Confederate armies, and so that left their story essentially untold. To find this place on the battlefield, you actually have to seek it out, and that's what we've done. So John Kuhn lived right over here with his wife and 5 children in the house, just built 3 years before the battle. In the spring of 1860, the neighborhood continued to expand that year, and the availability of Kuhn's bricks helped with that expansion of Gettysburg. But still, around the few houses that were here, it was still pretty open, rural, and apart from the main town. On the slope to the north of the Brickyard, into the east and to the south, you could only see wheat fields. Coster's brigade belonged to Brigadier General Adolph von Steinwehr's 2nd Division and Major General Oliver Otis Howard's 11th Corps. His brigade consisted of 4 volunteer infantry regiments from both Pennsylvania and New York. Now, Coster was only 23 years old, and he had served as a private in the 12th U.S. Infantry. He'd been wounded at the Battle of Gaines' Mill during the Peninsula Campaign. He'd been promoted to captain because of his bravery there. This was his first battle as a brigade commander, so he was untried in command. Now, morale and esprit weren't the best in the 1st Brigade because of its brief but futile stand against Stonewall Jackson's epic flank attack at Chancellorsville just a few months previous in May. They were endlessly insulted and derided following that rout at Jackson's hands. Ethnic animosity made the situation even worse. The large numbers of German Americans in the Corps were the targets of prejudice, so ethnic tensions were already near a boiling point between the 1st Brigade's largely native-born American New York regiments and who they called the Damn Dutchmen from Pennsylvania. Coster placed his 2 New York regiments along the Baltimore Pike on the northeast end of Cemetery Hill, in and around Evergreen Cemetery, in support of a New York artillery battery. From Cemetery Hill, they could see billowing clouds of gun smoke to the north. They knew a terrible battle was raging, and they also knew that they were going to be sent into it pretty quickly. Hill's Corps had two brigades of Georgians, Gordon's of Early's division and Brigadier General George Dole's brigade of Major General Robert E. Rhodes's division. Now, remember that in the afternoon of July 1st, the Union 11th Corps was in retreat. Dole's brigade had hit the 11th Corps line in the vicinity of Carlisle Road and sent two Union brigades into a disorganized retreat through and into town. At that same time, Gordon's brigade hit the exposed Union right flank on Blocker's Knoll, which would soon be known as Barlow's Knoll, and after some fighting there, drove the other two 11th Corps brigades toward Gettysburg as well. At about that same time, Hill's forces were driving the 1st Corps from its positions west of Gettysburg back into town. So two entire Union Corps were in a wild retreat through the town of Gettysburg. Oliver Otis Howard was being continually asked for reinforcements to bolster the 11th Corps lines. Each time Howard refused until he was given really no choice when Gordon's Georgians and Louisianans were suddenly threatening the Corps right flank at Blocker's Knoll. Custer's brigade was now being sent to reinforce the 11th Corps line. Custer's men headed down Baltimore Street into Gettysburg at a quick step, and with the 134th New York in the lead, followed by the 154th New York. They were soon joined by two Pennsylvania regiments. Now, you just have to imagine being a soldier here in Custer's brigade and seeing the streets and sidewalks lined with wounded Union soldiers, some crawling on their hands and knees, others seeking shelter between buildings and in alleys, and still others being carried by comrades into the rear, and cavalrymen clinging to their wounded horses. At some point during that march, a decision was made to place the 73rd Pennsylvania in reserve near the town's railroad station, leaving Custer with about 977 men. His three remaining regiments crossed the railroad tracks to reach the Brickyard. As they arrived, a cannonball struck the corner of Coons's house and sent a shower of bricks flying, striking the members of the 154th. So you had the 134th on the brigade's right flank and the 154th in the center, all formed up along a fence marking the Brickyard's northern boundary in front of those brick kilns. Custer was with the 27th Pennsylvania on the left flank, where he could look down the slope and see his two New York regiments. Noticing a gap between the 134th and the 154th, Lieutenant Colonel Cantador ordered a battalion of the 27th to plug it, but in the noise and in the chaos, only 50 men under 1st Lieutenant Adolphus D. Vogelbach responded to that order. As a result, the brigade's position was tenuous. Both flanks were unsupported and in danger of being enveloped by the attacking Georgians. The terrain was terrible. To the north of the Brickyard, the ground rose abruptly, so no one could see the direction from which the enemy would be coming. One of the things you're able to see, it's not an advantageous position because you're almost in a depression. As you can see, the ground swelling up in front of us, and then over here to the west, you can see that ridgeline where that car is coming down with its lights on. So, but this was the site that they chose. And to make matters even worse, that elevated terrain was covered in wheat that was ready for harvesting. So by the time they were seen by the 154th, the rebels were only 220 yards away. The tops of the Confederate battle flags suddenly could be seen bobbing up and down over the wheat as the North Carolinians and Louisianans, about 3,000 in all, advanced until a volley from Custer's brigade here in the Brickyard stopped them. They immediately returned fire and the battle began, with Custer's men kneeling or lying behind the rail fence. They immediately began to sustain casualties. Custer's stand in the Brickyard was pretty brief. Members of the 154th had time to fire only 6 to 9 shots. Avery's men swung around the right flank of the 134th and unleashed this devastating enfilading fire. With his regiment badly shot up and in danger of being surrounded, Lieutenant Colonel Jackson ordered the 134th in retreat. Many of the men were struck down as they left the cover of Coon's fence, and they fled the Brickyard and darted through the fields and lots toward the railroad and the town and Cemetery Hill beyond. On the Union left, the Tigers sent the 27th Pennsylvania and Custer reeling in retreat, pouring into the large gap between the 27th and Heckman's battery. Heckman's gunners would fire 113 rounds, an average of 28 per gun, mostly canister, over a period of about half an hour before the battery was overrun. 2 guns were captured. At first, only the 27th Pennsylvania heard Custer's order to retreat, but when Lieutenant Colonel Allen of the 154th saw the 134th driven from the Brickyard, he ordered a retreat left toward the carriage gateway and North Stratton Street. The lots and fields around here were swarming with Hayes's Confederates, and Avery's men quickly climbed over the fence into the Brickyard, forcing a mass surrender of Custer's men. Some of Custer's men hid in area houses, some crowded into the cellar of John Coons's home, where they were easily captured. After driving Custer's men from the Brickyard, Hayes's brigade continued the pursuit into the town, shooting and capturing more Union soldiers. When the 134th New York reassembled on Cemetery Hill that evening, it had only 5 officers and 27 enlisted men remaining. For the 154th New York, only 3 officers and 15 enlisted men remained. A number of stragglers found their way to the regiments. The exhausted men slept among the headstones in Evergreen Cemetery. About a quarter of Custer's brigade was killed or wounded in the Brickyard fight. So, what makes the Brickyard fight so significant? There's lots of debate, but on one point there's absolutely no doubt. By slowing the attack of 2 of the last fresh Confederate brigades here on this ground, a single Union brigade bought time for other Federal units to escape to the shelter of Cemetery Hill. Consequently, that made a late afternoon Confederate assault on Cemetery Hill more unlikely. Had that attack happened, it's quite possible that the Confederates would have been able to position themselves on what was arguably the most important terrain on the entire battlefield. The Brickyard fight, ladies and gentlemen, on Custer Avenue here in Gettysburg, and I'm John Fenzel. This was a mural that was done, I think, in 1988 by Mark Dunkelman and another historian, but really fabulously done, all covered in plexiglass, so it's preserved. And you can see the line of the Confederates approaching from north to south.